frustrated.
In the end, if you've got two people who want to be on the line,
I spoke with
Good evening, everybody.
Furukawa,
Hello.
the Japanese side.
Um, Welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful evening. Before I hand you over to Charles Scanlon, who will be chairing this evening's discussion, if I can ask you to turn your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we are broadcasting live. Over to Charles.
Thank you very much. We're going to do this as a sort of panel discussion, but a panel discussion with lots of contributions and questions from the audience. We're going to try and sort of break it down into sort of different aspects, different themes, but there has to be an element of fluidity, so we won't be too rigid about that. But I'd just say that, you know, if we're discussing, say, North Korea's military capabilities, and then we ask questions from the floor, it might be best to keep your question to the subject we've just been discussing rather than to go on to China or something, because that'll be the next thing that we move on to. We're all just going to say a couple of words, 2 or 3 minutes about ourselves before we kick off, and then we'll go into the first theme, which is about North Korea's diplomatic strategy. I'm an East Asia editor at BBC. I'm also a former correspondent who covered South Korea and Japan for a few years. I've been to North Korea 7 times in total. I think we're at that stage in the story now where there's a slight lull. We've had 2 months of constant headlines about North Korea. We're at that stage when there's a lull, when journalists look back and say, did we overcover this? Did we make too much of it? North Korea, it's not the first time that we've been up to one of these confrontations, these crises, which then seem to sort of disappear like a puff of smoke. So I think, you know, it's a time to look back and say whether the news media covered itself in glory. There's been lots of journalists running around in Seoul trying to find something to report. Since the missile test and the nuclear test, it's really been largely words from Pyongyang. No one's fired a shot. No one's been hurt. The first crisis that I covered was in 1994 when there was quite a serious confrontation. And when I arrived in Seoul in the spring of '94, people were panic buying rice and noodles. So there was a sense that you know, war could break out on the peninsula. There was then all the blame started afterwards that the news media had overplayed it. When the Clinton administration people actually started coming out and telling the real story, it turned out that the media had underplayed it, and that the Americans at the time were considering, you know, massive military reinforcements into South Korea, which could have provoked a North Korean preemptive attack. The Americans were thinking about bombing Yongbyon. So sometimes it's hard to judge how serious they are. But the idea of the crazed young dictator with a nuclear bomb has certainly seeped into the public consciousness. And I hear that Tony Blackburn on Radio Berkshire has been cross-examining North Korean experts about the Korean People's Army. So it's definitely gone viral. If the North Koreans are playing psychological warfare and they want to get attention, they've certainly succeeded. Andrea Berger of the Royal United Services Institute is the one of us who's most recently been to Pyongyang. She got interesting meetings there with people from the army, from the party, and from the state. She got much better access than the average journalist gets, who tend to be restricted to looking at monuments, even if they are posing as diplomats or academics.
Yes.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about that,
Sure.
and then we'll move on to the others.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. I'm definitely a much more recent North Korea watcher, if I can call it that. But like Charles said, I was in Pyongyang not too long ago, in November, for a set of nuclear talks with the Korean People's Army, with the Workers' Party, and with their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which each were were different and quite unique discussions. And we were also there at a particularly interesting time, which was shortly before a set of leadership contests in a number of countries relevant to the North Korean issue. We were there the week before the US presidential election and the 18th Party Congress, and of course the following month you had electoral contests in Japan and South Korea, and this was something that was at the top of the North Koreans' mind as well. So those talks provided a really interesting backdrop personally for analysis of the latest situation as well. Some of the thinking in North Korea on military exercises, for instance, or on the governments of those countries I just mentioned. So happy to talk about that a little bit more.
Thank you. John Swenson-Wright is just, the last couple of days, back from Seoul, which is, as always, a hotbed of intelligence and gossip about what's really going on in North Korea beyond the stereotypes. So John will just say a few words about what's going on in Seoul.
Yeah, as Charles says, I've just come back from having spent about 5 weeks in Seoul, and I suppose the most striking thing is the contrast between the way the outside world, and in particular the international media, has seen the crisis on the peninsula. The mood on the street in Seoul is one of relative calmness. I think most South Koreans have, quite understandably, for such a long time discounted the threat from North Korea. They've had to live with it on a daily basis. So it's a bit of a surreal experience sitting there, reading newspapers telling you of the imminent onset of World War III and nuclear Armageddon, and seeing people go about their daily lives without much sense of disquiet or concern. Now, of course, the view on the part of government elites is much more different. And for me, the really interesting aspect of that contrast between the public view and the government view has been the efforts by the new leader of South Korea, Park Geun-hye, to try and tread a really fine line between, on the one hand, I think maintaining an air of composure and unflappability in the face of all these provocations we've seen from the north, while at the same time managing her own cabinet, which is quite divided in terms of the position that the different key actors have been adopting in response to the North Korean threat. You have a defense minister who's been talking in quite a forceful, I wouldn't say belligerent way, but in a way that I think is designed to reinforce the deterrence capabilities of South Korea and its American ally. And at the same time, you've got a Minister of Unification who's talking really about more dialogue between the South and North, even in the face of these provocations. And that creates a real practical challenge for Park Geun-hye. How does she manage her cabinet? How does she manage these divergent points of view? Are the individual members of the government acting solo, independently, or is this a carefully calibrated strategy on the part of the government to have a good cop and a bad cop, in a sense, articulating different strategies with those different objectives? It's very hard to unravel that because of the limits of access to information of those discussions. But what I've been trying to do in sitting in Seoul is to get a better sense of the South Korean perspective. Ironically, in a way, despite the proximity of Pyongyang, it's 30 miles away from Seoul or so, it's very difficult to really understand what's happening in the north from the vantage point of South Korea, notwithstanding the great deal of expertise and talent and time spent by South Korean analysts trying to make sense of the north.
Great, thank you, John. And John, Everard was the British ambassador in Pyongyang for 2 years. So unlike most of us, he spent a decent amount of time observing on a day-to-day basis. And I think, John, you're just going to bring us right up to date with where we are with the North Koreans at the moment.
Well, yes, who knows where we are. But I wanted just to perhaps kick off debate by offering a few thoughts as to why what has happened, and what might happen next. This is a kind of, look, I don't know the answer to those questions. If I did, I'd be paid a lot more than I am. But as a hunch that you might want to chew on, I think that right at the beginning of the current round of provocations, the one that's coming to a lull just now, the North Koreans made a statement that received insufficient attention. And that statement was that the time had come for a final settling of accounts with the United States. Now, over the last weeks, all kinds of theories have been brought forward as to why North Korea decided to escalate tension quite so rapidly, to use quite such vicious rhetoric, much more vicious than it has traditionally used in similar occasions in the past. These explanations included Kim Jong-un trying to solve domestic problems. He had a series of high-level, very large political meetings during the time of these threats, where he replaced a lot of ministers. That was within the background. There was, of course, the exercises between the US and the DPRK armed forces, which happen every year, and every year North Korea protests. But I think given the way that the North Koreans continued the escalation, even after the United States offered North Korea a ladder to climb down by famously postponing their own missile test. At that point, Kim Jong-un, had it just been a question of domestic perspective, had just been a question of trying to show that he's strong against the joint exercises, he could have claimed victory. He could have turned to his people and said, that's it. Once again, these filthy imperialists have capitulated. They have postponed the missile test. The North Korean people win yet again. He didn't do that. And it leads me to think that what is happening is that the North Koreans want a specific outcome from these series of escalations. They want the United States finally to recognize them as a nuclear weapon state. They want the United States to cease what they call their hostile policy against North Korea, which is a rather fuzzy concept, it's nevertheless central to North Korean thinking, which we can perhaps analyse as we discussed tonight. And, of course, they want aid. The need for aid, I think, was underlined by the leak a few days ago that the North Koreans had asked the Mongolians for food aid. Whatever NGOs on the ground are saying about the harvest this year, I'm starting to think that the North Koreans themselves, the North Korean regime, believe that they have a food problem yet again. Now, why then did the North Koreans suddenly stop escalating over a weekend, just before the great anniversary celebrations a week and a bit ago? I think it was because after his round of diplomacy, Kerry said, okay, under certain conditions we can talk. And North Korea said, okay, fine, halt, let's explore this, see if this is actually a capitulation, if the Americans are going to give us what we want. And of course, since then, we have had a ding-dong series of remarks by the Americans, by the North Koreans, setting out conditions for talks, both of sides rejecting the others, as happened before. And my hunch is that at some point the penny will drop in Pyongyang that North Korea has not actually got any of its objectives. And the big worry is what they do then. I think it is likely that they will then start again the escalation that they broke off just before the birthday party, just before April the 15th. And of course, they have already exhausted a lot of the things that they can do with minimal risk. If you are escalating a situation, if you're trying to build in tension, you have somebody is sitting, or probably a committee sitting in Pyongyang, with what must look like a big advent calendar. What are we going to do on this day? What are we going to do on this day? And as you exhaust the actions you can take, you're drawn into areas where it's become risky. And the thing that keeps me awake at night, other than my cat licking me, is that the North Koreans don't really have a grasp of where American and South Korean red lines are. And that as this process resumes and continues, they will inadvertently cross one of those red lines, provoke a response, and then, in the words of a senior American analyst, we're all off to the races. I'll leave that with you. Thanks.
Well, that's a good place where we can pick up, and I'll ask John to address that question. Are we looking at a strategic genius? Are we looking at a state that really understands its geographic position? It understands it's weak. It understands that it's poor. It understands that it's surrounded by giant neighbors, China, Russia, Japan, the United States in the Western Pacific, is it using the only cards that it has in order to assert itself and get what it wants as part of a well-mapped out strategy that has had some success? This is a state that's trying to survive in a hostile world. Is this part of that long strategy that's kept the regime alive for the 20 years, or are we seeing something different? Are we seeing a hot-headed young man who's in a hurry to get the glory that he felt was reflected on his father and grandfather?
I think there is, from my read of the situation, a very calibrated approach on the part of the North. And I take John's point about, the danger that they, in the face of a United States that has emphasized the importance of deterrence, and fortunately for the region and further afield has been successful in maintaining deterrence. I do think, nonetheless, there are some very specific objectives, and you could argue that they've been partially successful in realizing some of them. Let's consider one very obvious piece of evidence, the decision to restart the facility at Yongpyong. If that situation continues, some have speculated that within 6 months, certainly a year, North Korea will be able to start reprocessing plutonium and increasing its nuclear assets, and therefore reinforcing its own deterrent capability and presenting a more belligerent posture to the outside world. And why is that important? Not only because it reinforces North Korea's own sense of security, and most people have argued that this is one of the kind of abiding features of North Korea's diplomatic strategy, but it also helps, from the point of view of Kim Jong-un and domestic politics in the North, to satisfy the demands of the military, a critical actor in the context of North Korean politics. So one can see the rationality behind that approach, as well as the strategic objective. Another objective, in a sense, which is still being tested as we sit here talking about the situation, is the relationship between the United States and South Korea. And some people, myself included, thought, looking at what the North was doing through this series of provocations, that they might have been attempting to test the new leadership of Park Geun-hye. And that's a very consistent pattern that we've seen when there's a transition in South Korean politics, that new incoming presidents are typically faced by a North Korea that doesn't give them the benefit of the doubt, that doesn't create a honeymoon period that allows them to reach out to the North. Park Geun-hye, of all people, as the daughter of the former authoritarian leader of the country, should have been best placed, in the words of one American analyst, to play a kind of South Korean Nixon to a North Korean Mao. And one of the interesting questions is whether there's still enough space, given these provocations, for that to take place. I think it was quite striking that the United States, during Kerry's visit, basically deferred to South Korea. Good alliance politics, to basically say, if Seoul decides that they want to talk with North Korea, then we're willing to endorse that strategy. And therefore, any attempt on the part of Pyongyang to create a wedge between Washington and Seoul, in my judgment, had failed. The problem, of course, with that approach is that Kerry presented this in very conditional terms. We will sit down and have dialogue with North Korea, but only if the North demonstrates its commitment to giving up its nuclear capabilities. What the North, I would argue, wants is a much more comprehensive set of discussions that embodies all the issues that Andrea referred to, a peace treaty, a peace regime, some form of assistance, some sort of political recognition, status acknowledgement. And I think this, to go back to your question, this attempt to use the external crisis as a means of legitimizing the leadership at home is very carefully calculated, and I think reflects the relative newness of the regime. I don't think Kim Jong-un is a mad, bad dictator who's likely to cross the red lines that the Americans have been, I would agree, poor at setting. I mean, if you look at American policy over the last 40 or 50 years, I would argue it's been more erratic than that coming out of North Korea. And that's the problem that the Obama administration has. In maintaining, ironically, a more consistent approach by trying to contain North Korea, by trying to avoid any possibility of conceding on the issues of the nuclear question, they've limited their diplomatic options. One other final piece, I think, of success, if you like, in terms of understanding the actions of North Korea, is that it's not just the United States and South Korea that they're directing their provocations at, it's also the international community. The fact that Ban Ki-moon came out on 2 occasions, perhaps more, arguing for direct talks with North Korea, demonstrates, I think, the limitations of Washington and Seoul's effort to manage this process. And in this context, of course, we all bear a responsibility, not least the international media, because we describe it as this crisis that could perhaps unravel in unpredictable ways. There's an argument for saying what we ought to be doing is actually ignoring North Korea. And the problem there, of course, is that's the third kind of objective, alongside regime strengthening and sitting down and having these wider talks that North Korea wants to pursue, is the policy of building up its nuclear capabilities. If you try and put North Korea in a box and contain it, you give it the opportunity to continue to engage in these efforts to proliferate and enhance its capabilities.
Yeah, I mean, I think later on we could have a sort of a little stint where we actually discuss American policy and what the Americans are trying to do and whether they're helping or fueling the fire. But I mean, one question for Andrea is, you know, in order for this North Korean strategy to work, their threats do have to be taken seriously. There has to be some substance behind it. The North Koreans like a certain amount of ambiguity as to exactly what they've got, what they're capable of. They thrive on that ambiguity. But should we take North Korea's threat seriously? 20 years ago, there was a genuine belief that the North could still invade the South. They could be in Busan in a couple of weeks. And I don't think anyone believes now that the North Korean conventional army could succeed in the way it would have done 20, 30 years ago.
Sure. Before just maybe going into some of North Korea's capabilities and whether or not they can actually carry out the threats they've been making, I think you're exactly right to say that we haven't been buying a lot of them, and North Korea's recognized that. If you look at sort of the evolution of their threats over the course of the past 2 months, you had the first few weeks where North Korea was really doing things that required minimum effort, but for which they got maximum propaganda output. So things like not picking up the phones at the other end of the military hotline, or telling diplomats in Pyongyang that they should consider leaving the country, or, for instance, declaring that North Korea would directly attack U.S. Bases in Hawaii, Guam, and on the continental United States. Those are the sorts of things that North Korea was perfectly able to do with minimum effort, but which got them a lot of attention. When sort of after a few weeks we all started saying, well, we don't really buy any of this, this is just typical North Korean bluster, then you started to see a little bit of change in activity, and certainly there were other factors intervening here as well. But you had, for instance, then very quickly, actually over the course of about 42 hours, you had the North Koreans announcing they're going to restart their plutonium road to a bomb. You had the disruption of operations at the Kaesong Industrial Zone, and all of a sudden we started asking questions, well, why on earth would they harm themselves? And thinking a little bit more seriously about what North Korea was doing. They, of course, then started moving around mobile missile launchers, and everyone flew back again into a panic. So there seems to be a recognition by the North of where we feel there are gaps in the credibility of their rhetoric, and that's something they have seemed willing to act upon. So are the threats credible? Going back to your question, there's got to be, for threats to be credible, there has to be both capability and intent. And on the capability side, there's a very large question mark over both the North's nuclear capabilities, but also their ballistic missile capabilities. On the ballistic missile front, I mean, they've been threatening assets quite far removed from North Korea. And we don't suspect at the present time that they have the capability to strike those long-range targets with ballistic missiles. They're ballistic missiles that can hit places like Guam, Hawaii, and the continental United States are all untested, and that's a pretty key point there. Yes, they've had satellite launches, but despite the commonalities in the type of technology you need to launch a satellite and those that you need to carry out a strike with a ballistic missile, there are still some notable differences that do require operational testing as a ballistic missile. Things like payload reentry. So actually, getting what you need to come back down to carry out a strike is a pretty crucial part. In addition, you need to be able to test those ballistic missiles in all types of situations. So a satellite launch, you can be patient while your launch vehicle is sitting there on the platform and wait for ideal conditions so that you can monitor what's going on. Ballistic missile has to be able to work operationally in all sorts of scenarios. So those are two pretty key differences, and if the North Koreans haven't had a tested capability, that's quite crucial. On the nuclear side, they also have to be able to make their warheads compact enough to put them on a ballistic missile, and that payload on the ballistic missile has to survive some pretty intense conditions when it's flying. We have large reason to suspect that they may not be quite there yet. Going then over to intent, North Korea certainly seems like it's working to develop those capabilities. So even though they may not be there, they look like they want to reach that ability. So you've had statements, for instance, since about 2011, where KCNA has been putting out on a semi-regular basis discussions about how the Russians and the Chinese are actually pursuing an intercontinental ballistic missile capability to counter the evil American imperialists. And that's sort of setting the stage for a justification for North Korea to develop similar capabilities. They certainly seem like their efforts of parading missiles, whether or not they're operational, through the streets of Pyongyang signal that they want to get there eventually. However, that being said, would they actually, with little prompting and little fear of an imminent and existential incoming strike on their country, want to actually smack a target in Guam, Hawaii, or the United States? Probably not, because of the certain reaction that would come their way if they did that. So my assessment would be that they don't have the intent to actually strike something without feeling like they're imminently threatened first. So yes, North Korea perhaps in the future will be facing a different threat scenario with them, but over the past 2 months, we haven't been looking at a situation where we're going to get into a North Korean all-out war as they threaten.
Okay, that might be a good moment to just take some questions. If anyone has anything they want to ask, on those sort of general themes about what the North Koreans are up to, what they're trying to achieve, or how successful they're being. Yeah, please.
Can I ask just a very, very basic, immediate question? Which concerns me. Can you say something about what says an idiot question? What does North Korea actually want in 10 years' time? Where would they like to be? A stupid question. I mean, the Juche philosophy and this is about self-reliance, but is there still a desire for unification? And how do the South Koreans see that now? I mean, I've read them, like the Mars book about North Korea, saying that this was something the South Koreans wanted for quite earnestly for a while, but now are very mistrustful of what actually would happen. Can you see that actually being, what is the end, if it's a stupid question to us, what is the final desired outcome from the point of view of North Korea? Do they want to be a bad fairy tale state, or do they want to, do they have an ultimate objective that we can discuss?
Yeah, well, it's a very fundamental question. I mean, what do you think, John?
Yes, I think they have very clear objectives. I think they want, firstly, to be treated as an equal state. I don't think that they are any longer serious about taking the South over. They realise that is now not going to happen. They are very keen, though, for the South not to take them over. So, against indication from that way. And they also want aid. I mean, a lot of this comes down to hard money and sacks of rice. And in fairness to the North Koreans, they have said that repeatedly, and recently they haven't made any secret of those objectives.
Yes.
Perhaps leading on from the ambassador's question about, or point about their openness about aid, is there any indication that the regime in the north is sophisticated and determined enough and has actually carried out any financial manipulation of the crisis to profit the regime or members individually? I'm thinking of things like the cyber attacks on South Korea, and we know they've got the history of heroin trafficking, but I'm wondering if they've been playing the stock markets in periods of intention to make, for a small country in a fairly closed regime, what could be very significant sums. and so therefore there becomes a self-fulfilling aim which doesn't go beyond a certain level of insecurity. I say that because of rumours and allegations that they are at the end of a chain of production of advanced conventional weapons, which leads to them having some strange or not so strange friends who will help them produce these things for a cut of the proceeds.
Okay, John, do you want
Yes,
to say
sure.
that?
Firstly, the North Korean regime has exploited the geopolitical situation for its own ends for a very long time. And when I say for its own ends, in terms of the regime, members of the regime making money. Previous ambassador to Pyongyang, as Charles mentioned, up until November, I coordinated the United Nations panel of experts charged with the implementation of UN sanctions. And in that context, we used to watch the North Koreans selling all kinds of conventional weapons, as you rightly say, to sometimes the most unlikely people. So yes, to that extent, they have, the regime members have used the situation for their personal benefit, because of course weapon sales goes into effectively the palace treasury. I am not aware, though, that specifically they have used things like stock market movements to their benefit over the most recent outbursts. I'm not sure that we would, in any case, easily detect that. It would, I mean, obviously, the North Koreans are adept at precisely. They are adept at sort of trading through various front organizations, just as they sell arms through front organizations. And although it wouldn't surprise me to find that the North Koreans, of course, are in a unique position of knowing what they're going to say next, are exploiting that to short stocks in Seoul or whatever it might be, I can't actually point to evidence that that is the case.
It'd be a good story though if you had the evidence.
Yes.
Yes.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, Andrei Lankov, a long-standing North Korea watcher based in Seoul, has made just that argument, that this is an attempt to put pressure on the South Korean stock market to create a sense of crisis and therefore get the South Korean government to pony up some extra resources. And I haven't seen any confirmation of that. I think, apropos what they're trying to do, it's worth looking closely at some of the public statements. The New Year's address that Kim Jong-un presented to the nation was quite striking, I think, in terms of its commitment to economic improvement of economic conditions for the North Korean people. And he had this rather striking phrase where he said publicly on a previous occasion that the regime would never again ask the North Korean people to tighten their belts. And that seemed a curious statement, giving a hostage to fortune by promising to deliver economic prosperity, particularly for a regime that sees any kind of market opening as essentially opening the political structure to imminent collapse, because this will create more opportunities for a wider discourse. It is also striking that 2 or 3 weeks ago, when we had the meeting of the plenary session of the Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party, we had two important statements. One, a commitment to maintaining their nuclear deterrent. Two, a commitment again to economic prosperity. And three, the appointment of an avowed economic reformer as Prime Minister. And now, I think we should be careful not to over-exaggerate the significance of these statements. They're, I think, aspirational reflections of what the leadership would like. The interesting question is, how can they deliver on that? Threatening the outside community is unlikely to work. It may enable them to obtain certain amounts of humanitarian aid, and Park Geun-hye, before the recent crisis, surprised many people by starting to offer some limited humanitarian assistance. It brings us back to this kind of contradiction, which is the decision to close Kaesong, because it seems to be hurting themselves. The final point that I would make in this context in terms of their strategy, if we take a broader historical perspective, there were some interesting documents that were released under a Freedom of Information Act request in the United States from the 1970s, demonstrating that for the Nixon administration, both President Nixon and Kissinger concluded on the basis of a close analysis of what North Korea was doing way back then in the 1970s, that the North has had a consistent strategy of using this type of provocation to try and extract concessions from the outside world, that there is a kind of rational program behind their actions. Whether, in fact, the new leadership under Kim Jong-un is still playing by that playbook or not is harder to say, because there's so much about his personality and the degree of personal direction shaping these actions that we don't know about, that it's very difficult, I think, to determine conclusively that this is a coordinated, clear strategy on the part of the leadership.
Okay, well, that might be a moment when we can move on to talk a little bit about North Korea internal, unless there's just one more. Is there one more question on that area? Yeah, over here.
This might sound crass, but what odds would you give of like a uniform on uniform death in the next before the end of the year?
Of a what, sorry?
Sorry.
Of a uniform on uniform death, i.e., if soldiers from two opposing armies, one of them kills the other one. Would you put odds on that before the end of the year?
Oh, you mean actual opening fire on it? Well, why don't you?
I would say it's probably a low chance. Again, just the situation that they faced, and perhaps John can say more about this, but while Lee Myung-bak was in power in South Korea, was they saw that the South Koreans didn't react when they actually had an incident that caused the death of South Koreans. The current leader in South Korea has made very clear that that situation will not be repeated. And I were to think that that really the North Koreans might have heard that message. And we were talking a little bit earlier about Kaesong, but the South Korean reaction to Kaesong very recently about setting a deadline for this situation shows clearly that South Korea is going to set some boundaries this time, and I think that's definitely one of them. So we can have perhaps...
That's the joint factory area at Kaesong with 50,000
right.
North Koreans employed there. Should we just move on to... Oh, do you want to go ahead, yeah.
I probably gather, agree almost entirely with Andrea, but I think that the probability is actually quite high. I think, going back to a point that you made earlier, that of course the North Koreans are not going to deliver a missile to Guam even if they could hit it, Hawaii or anything like that. They have in the past got away with sinking a South Korean vessel and shedding South Korean gun emplacements on an island. And now that they've conducted the third nuclear test, I've got this sinking feeling they believe that they could get away with that again. And I think that as if there is a new escalation, as I believe they eventually will, that quite soon you get to the stage where somebody shoots somebody across the DMZ or a further military provocation is arranged. Not against the Americans, and they are not immediately suicidal, but against the South Koreans. Have they heard Park Geun-hye's warning that South Korea won't tolerate this? They've heard it, but I'm not at all sure that they believe it. The South Koreans have made strong statements in the past that they haven't followed through on, and I think there's a real risk that these statements are discounted in Pyongyang, and that Kim Jong-un believes he can get away with it.
There's a puzzle, though, in all of that, which is that then how do we explain the actions of Park Geun-hye in saying very publicly that she was willing to defer to the military, to give them the autonomy to act independent of any political considerations? You can see it in a positive way as her basically using the good cop, bad cop strategy as a means of reinforcing deterrence. But I think it also reflects a growing intolerance on the part of public opinion in South Korea to accept that South Korea should adopt this calibrated approach. There is, I think, more impatience and a perception that something tougher has to be adopted. And I think that then increases the risk of a conflict through miscalculation. It's one reason, I think, why the Americans, in deploying their strategic assets to the region, were as much intent on reassuring South Korea as they were at sending a signal to North Korea, in order to, in a sense, discourage some of the more trigger-happy military experts and commanders in South Korea from feeling compelled to do something really provocative. And for that reason, I think the urgency on the part of the United States in reinforcing deterrence is a positive sign. I don't think we've seen anything from the North Koreans that suggests that they're really, I would disagree with John on this point, we've been encouraged to take adversarial positions, and I think this is one where I would like to say things I think aren't as bad as they seem. Because after all, what hasn't happened? We haven't had a missile launch, despite all of the expectations that the movement of the missiles a few weeks ago was preliminary to just that. We haven't seen a gunfight break out. either at sea or at land. We haven't seen any evidence of infiltration. We haven't seen, for example, a blockade. Some people have speculated that what the North could do is blockade one of the contested islands between the two countries. And I think that suggests, and indeed one other factor that's quite significant, reports suggesting that Kim Jong-un personally sent out an order to his frontline units that they should do nothing that would provide an excuse. No shot should be fired in anger that would provide an excuse that would justify the South rather, from taking military action. If we take that historical reference that I mentioned earlier as compelling, then the North knows what it's doing. It's managing this very carefully. It's playing the diplomatic chess game very expertly. It's not getting perhaps as much as it would like, but for now, I think the ball is very much in the North's court.
Right. I mean, in the end, it's the South Koreans who are going to suffer the most if there's an outbreak of hostilities, because as we keep reminding people, Seoul is virtually in the front line. It's the northern suburbs of Seoul are within artillery range. If the South Koreans overreacted and provoked something, then they would suffer more than anybody. And just very briefly on that, the North Koreans still, we talk a lot about their missile capabilities. They still have a significant conventional threat on a city of 17 million people, and even if they can only hit the northern suburbs of Seoul with the normal tubes, that's still several million people in a modern city.
You're quite right, and actually that's one message we tried to bring to the North Koreans was, you may say you need a nuclear deterrence to prevent attack on your country, but if you look at the history since the end of the Korean War, there were decades before you had a nuclear weapons capability where your conventional capabilities were perfectly sufficient deterrence for you. I'm not sure whether or not they heard that message either, but that's one point that we've tried to make, because certainly history does suggest that their conventional deterrence is quite strong.
And we have seen in the past that the South Koreans get nervous when they think that the Americans might be about to overreact. Sometimes the Americans get nervous if they think the South Koreans are about to overreact. And this is something the North Koreans can play on by sort of driving wedges. But I mean, if we could just move on to a little section just on North Korea internal, and that is about the nature of Kim Jong-un, or what we know of him. Sometimes you see in the media, the Western media, they refer to it as a royal family. In fact, North Korea, I was in North Korea 4 or 5 years ago before Kim Jong-un took over, and there was a lot of speculation at the time as to who would be, once Kim Jong-il dies, who would take over. Nobody knew who his sons were. There was no royal family. You were allowed to know who his father is and his mother and all this, but the sons were not known to North Koreans, and it was dangerous to talk about it. So if we raised the question of which son will get the job, deathly silence, because nobody wants to get involved in that. So this man was sprung, and he's not the first son, he's the youngest son, and he was sprung on the North Korean people something like 18 months before he got the top job, which is completely different to his father, who had a good long run in a couple of decades. So seeing as that he came from nowhere as far as the North Korean people are concerned, he's done quite a good job of consolidating himself, hasn't he?
Well, yes, he has, but he's not there yet. He was chosen because his elder brother Kim Jong-chol was regarded as just a bit too soft, a nice person. You can't have nice people running North Korea; it doesn't fit. So Kim Jong-un, who the famous sushi chef describes as much more aggressive, punchy, loved to win at volleyball, all the heroic qualities you will look for in a North Korean leader, gets the job. He's been in it for rather over a year now, and he's held the place together. It wasn't clear from the outset that would happen. There was a fascinating article based on a North Korean soldier just a couple of weeks ago that indicated that people had actually been shooting each other over who was going to succeed Kim Jong-il. The succession was not tidy. But he still has to convince the gnarled old men who run the military that he is tough, that he's good, and that he commands the respect of the Korean people. There have been attempted coups in the past in North Korea. He knows that, and he will be watching his back all the time. And I think this is part of what is driving him at the moment. This actually sort of goes back to a point that John made, the economy. He focuses on the economy in the New Year editorial. This is clearly worrying the regime. He knows that after all these years of promises, he has got to deliver, and he frankly hasn't got a way of doing it. Every now and then, the regime talks of economic reform. When it does that, it doesn't mean economic reform in any sense that you or I might recognise. It tends to mean sort of just driving the economy up the internal political agenda at the expense of other areas. Every now and then, Pak Bong-ju, who's now back in power, when he was in power last time, used to put up papers to the superiors within the regime saying that we need to reform this, need to reform that, and they would simply come back marked, no, this is not accord with Juche thought. You know, the Ayatollahs at the top would simply squelch any change to the system, and I have no reason to think that that has changed.
I mean, the military men who were carrying Kim Jong-il's coffin at that funeral when we saw the whole city weeping and wailing, I mean, they've all gone, haven't they? The people, the military men who were supposed to be overseeing the transition, does that mean he's taking control of the military? What does it mean?
Some of them have gone. Ri Yong-ho has gone, for example, and removed in a way that suggested that he had consolidated his political power. But there's been a rehabilitation of another political figure, the man responsible for the coordinated policy of infiltration into South Korea. And some people have suggested that individual, who was also associated with the sinking of the Cheonan in March of 2010 and the Yonpyong shelling, is back in business. Now, whether that reflects the power of an institutional body of actors, the military, or a key individual is harder to say. I think it's very difficult, really, to try and unpack the extent to which Kim Jong-un himself is personally driving this process. I think John's absolutely right to say that the nervousness about what economic reform looks like is one reason, and the fear that any opening of the door will do to North Korea what happened to, for example, Romania under Ceausescu, that reform itself will create this uncontrollable body of opinion that will eventually topple the regime. And therefore, I think it's unlikely that they're really going to embrace that issue very comprehensively. What I think is probably a problem for the regime that won't go away, and is one reason why some people in South Korea are saying you should squeeze North Korea economically now, you should actually close down Kaesong, is the fact that the North's control over the economy as a whole has gradually, ineluctably, become much, much weaker. And you've now got, in a sense, private pockets of economic activity, if you like, a grey economy, which is functioning imperfectly, but is actually making life better for ordinary North Koreans. That the kind of acute level of poverty that North Korea experienced in the mid-1990s is no longer there. So in some ways, the country is better off, but it's precisely because those actors are acting independently. And the government can't, in a sense, rein them back in. It doesn't have the degree of control it used to have. And in the face of losing that control, it reinforces that sense of crisis with the outside world as a means of kind of stamping its authority back on the society and the economy as a whole. Which again is one reason, in a sense, why the outside world shouldn't provide further confirmation of that situation of crisis. It's one argument why some in South Korea, and increasingly in the international community, and some in the United States, are saying that the Obama administration should actually call the North Korean bluff and start talking. Because once you open the door to that wider set of negotiations, the ability of the North to maintain that sense of crisis becomes much weaker, and in turn, the leadership finds it harder to justify its own existence.
Yeah, I just had one quick thought. I think it's interesting from this discussion, and it raises a question in my mind of when we're thinking about to what degree Kim Jong-un as a person has been the factor that has made the latest situation feel somewhat different because it's been louder, the threats have been more specific. I wonder then whether the type of behavior and the type of rhetoric we've seen from North Korea lately is going to be a precedent or not. If Kim Jong-un is the factor, has he created an expectation among the military that he's trying to consolidate power with, that he's going to behave this way in the future? So the next time the US does military exercises, or you have a new sanctions resolution against North Korea coming out from the UN, is there going to be an expectation that behaves the same way? I think that's a question that I don't have the answer to, but might come out of this sort of discussion.
But you met these military men in November. What did they say? Were they happy?
They protested quite a lot to this idea that Kim Jong-un might be putting an increased emphasis on the economy, and they actually mentioned the exact quote that John did, which was the promise. They said that North Koreans will never have to tighten their belt again. And the Army was clear in their meetings, in our meetings with them, that under no circumstances should we take this to mean that the Army is in any way being displaced in its importance in the North Korean system. And I personally feel that they reiterated this message so often that I found it overwrought really. And it might have actually signaled a real nervousness that that's exactly what was going to happen. So perhaps there was a push for Kim Jong-un to quell the fears of the military and show that, in fact, he is willing to treat the outside world with a loud voice and a firm hand.
Because otherwise that's precisely the kind of situation in which you get military coups. Where the military feel that they are being disempowered, you kill before you're killed. I mean, in North Korea, that's the way it works. Can I amplify a point that John made? The grey economy. What is the regime? They can't rein it in. They tried to twice, in 2005 and in 2009. They are now in the worst of all worlds. They recognise that they can't actually stop the markets functioning. They're essential now to the overall economy. And especially in 2009, they really hacked off the market traders. So you've ended up with a kind of bizarre class in North Korea that no longer owes its allegiance primarily to the state. It makes money from other sources. It has to keep a political krisha, with this in Russian, a roof, protection over itself, sure, but that's not where the money comes from. And these people remember that all the money they piled up until 2009 was stolen from them by the state. What do you think they think of the North Korean regime?
That's a good moment for questions, anyhow, on anything internal or about Kim Jong-un. Not so many. Oh, yes, here we are.
I'm intrigued to know what ordinary Koreans think about it. I mean, we're talking about the armed, leadership and pretty strange politics generally that hard to understand rational other than its self-preservation. But if I think across to Germany when there were East and West Germans that I met were very keen on reunification but thought it could never happen in their lifetime. I'm going back 20 years or so. I wonder what ordinary Koreans think about the prospects of any prospect of reunification, or whether there's a desire from it from either the north or the southern population.
I mean, we had a defector was talking about this the other day, a man who's living here in London now. But he was saying that actually ordinary North Koreans want a war. They want a war and they want unification. And the reason, he said the leaders don't want a war, but he said that the ordinary people want a war because they see that as a way of breaking out of their desperate lives. They see it as a crisis that can happen, and then they can get over it, and then they can move. They've been indoctrinated from a very early age to believe that when unification comes, everything will be all right, the hardship will be over. So that's deeply imbued. I think it's less. I think the South Koreans are rather less enthusiastic than they used to be. But John, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, two pieces of anecdotal evidence. I spent last summer teaching in South Korea, and I was struck talking to young South Koreans about the issue of unification, how strong the kind of allergic reaction is to that idea. It's too costly. It's not really our country any longer. And that perception that North Korea is weird and different is not just confined to the outside world. Plenty of young South Koreans feel that the burden of engaging with the North is just too big. Another anecdote, though, which I think is quite revealing, is that last year we had 3 North Korean students at Cambridge. And that was something that was supported by our government. They provided the financial wherewithal to that. And the response we had from the North Koreans who came, and also from the North Korean embassy here in the UK, was very positive. One of the 3 was a visiting student of about 22 years old. And he said that his generation, the teenagers growing up in Pyongyang, the future is centered around economics and trade. And that for his generation, they no longer see themselves as having a career in politics, for example. So it confirms what John was saying, that kind of politics as a route to success in North Korea is increasingly less attractive. They also said, particularly the youngest of the three, that they saw the leadership under Kim Jong-un before the crisis as being different, and they see that as a positive indication. And the North Koreans, particularly those members of the Pyongyang elite, are doing exactly what their South Korean counterparts are doing. They want a successful education for their kids, and as a result, they're moving every possible opportunity to ensure that their kids can go to good schools overseas, whether it's Cambridge or universities in New York State. And that opens a real opportunity, I would argue, in the medium to long term for enterprising governments, NGOs, and there are increasingly lots of NGOs that are trying to do this. We had 16 of our students go to North Korea last summer to try and create this kind of new environment in which there's more dialogue. It's obviously not dealing with the immediate strategic threat of North Korea, but if you take a long-term perspective, that's probably the route that's going to be most successful in creating meaningful change on the peninsula.
Okay. Is there anything more on that? Oh, John, yeah,
Yes,
go ahead.
as much as you like. Firstly, we were at the same meeting where I heard the same defectors say that ordinary North Korean people wanted war. In all the, I don't know how many conversations I had with ordinary North Koreans where I lived there, I never once got this. I rather suspect that this was a former army officer who was actually, I mean, I'm quite ready to believe that in barrack rooms they sat and thumped tables and said, we want war. I'm not at all sure that this feeling is shared by the civilian population. Unification. The one thing that I could always be sure of talking to North Koreans was that if you mention unification, their eyes would go misty. They would almost certainly break out saying Arirang, and they would say, unification, yes please, yesterday. For them, unification is the millennium. Unification is the great day when their rice rations are handed out in full. Unification is the day when they can actually afford to buy all those smart dresses they see in the Pyongyang shops that are only ever sold to foreigners. The enthusiasm for unification amongst all the North Koreans I knew was strong and consistent. Sorry, should I go on? Or?
Yeah, why not? Unless there's another question.
Yes, I've got another question.
Oh, there's one here.
Because I had saw them out of this being.
I can't claim to have any sort of expertise on North Korea. I've never been there, except that I have taken an interest in it for the last 60 years. I read a book on its history even before the Korean War broke out, so I've taken an interest in it without claiming any particular insight. But my understanding is that the overriding desire throughout that period has been for unification, and not, although you say this about the goodies of the South Koreans being the reason for it today, I think long before that, in fact, as I remember it, in the early years after the end of the war, North Korea was making more progress than South Korea economically. So there's all sorts of complicated issues there. It's obviously much more difficult today to achieve unification than it might have been had a peace treaty been signed in the 1950s, for example. But I think you said they wanted a peace treaty, peace regime, and recognition. Those, regardless of the nature of the North Korean regime, which agreed is pretty horrific, those seem to me to be very reasonable desires on their part. I think I'll leave it there, but I'd like to come back on the nuclear issue, if I may, at some stage, because I'd like to say something about the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its relevance to the situation.
Sure. I mean, actually, given time, I mean, that's quite a good opportunity for us to move on to talk about the way the Americans are handling this and the whole American role in this dynamic. Because we tend to, it's often sort of portrayed in the media as North Korea acting in isolation, in a vacuum, North Koreans playing up again. I mean, this is a dynamic that involves lots of other countries, not least the United States. The role that the Americans are playing, is it possible, I mean, I'll put this to John, is it possible to make a case that the reason why the North Koreans are taking such a hardline stance at the moment is because they feel that the Americans are putting the squeeze on them, that the Americans are starting to get serious about sanctions after going through the motions, rather, at the UN for a few years. They've started to get serious about that. The Americans have now brought up this issue of human rights again, and that's been driven through in Geneva at the United Nations, another very, very sensitive issue for the North Koreans who equate talk of human rights as regime change. Are they responding to what they see as America putting the pressure on?
I don't think so. I mean, I think if you look at the sanctions regime and ask yourself concretely what has changed for the North Korean senior leadership, there's a little annex that says, we're going to put limits on access to luxury cars and certain kind of luxury products. The suggestion that that's going to really impose pain on the North Korean leadership, I think, is frankly unconvincing. What I think is more likely is that they're fed up with the United States simply not taking them seriously and actually not listening to them and ignoring them. There's an argument for saying President Obama is simply too busy to give attention to North Korea. Critics in Washington who've long been arguing for engagement with the North or a more sophisticated approach would argue that it's been puzzling that appointments within the new Obama administration, the second-term Obama administration, haven't left space for anyone who's really knowledgeable about Korea, who can actually make the case for a more sophisticated approach. And the problem is that the Obama administration, for quite legitimate reasons, not least its concern to deal with issues in the Middle East, or perhaps because to take a more critical perspective, President Obama is not that serious about foreign policy, and he's more focused on domestic issues, simply hasn't given enough attention to North Korea. And so the North is basically trying to force them to take them seriously and to try and demonstrate that containment won't work for all the reasons we've talked about. And I think if I had to sort of single out one criticism of the Obama administration, is its belief that it has time. I don't think it does have time. There was a very interesting assessment produced last year by an analyst at the Congressional Research Service who said, okay, let's look at the strategic threat from North Korea. We know that it's trying to develop an HEU program. We know that it's trying to weaponize its nuclear capabilities and put it on a ballistic missile. The conventional wisdom has been that that's going to take them 3 to 5 years, which may well be true, although the Defense Intelligence Agency report suggests an alternative perspective. When you look at short-range missiles, some suggestions are that it's about a year or two away from it actually being able to reach that capability. And that's one very powerful reason to say the Obama administration doesn't have the luxury of time. It can't contain it, not only because of the actual strategic threat posed by North Korea, but because of the knock-on effect within the region. We've got an administration in Japan under Prime Minister Abe, which is itching to increase its defense capabilities, deployed its Patriot batteries, not merely to protect its own space, but also to develop its weapons capability, not just to deal with North Korea, but to deal with the potential challenge of China. And we've got within South Korea increasingly a vocal defense community that says South Korea should have its own nuclear capabilities. And tactical nuclear weapons should be reintroduced into the peninsula. The idea that you can simply see the North Korean issue as a question of recognition or peace treaties and forget about these other issues is, I think, a fatal mistake on the part of the Obama administration.
Can part of the North Korean strategy be to provoke an overreaction by the Americans? If your game is to divide your neighbors, divide your enemies, divide your friends, if you're trying to play a divide and rule strategy, if you can provoke the Americans into overreacting on the Korean Peninsula, that's going to alarm the Chinese. The Chinese are going to get very upset about that. It's also going to alarm the South Koreans who are in the firing line. Even the Japanese can sometimes get alarmed when they feel the Americans are overdoing it. The Americans spent 20, 25 years trying to persuade the North Koreans they didn't have a nuclear deterrent actually on the ground in South Korea as opposed to the umbrella. The Americans have since flown nuclear-capable B-52s and B-2 bomber coming all the way from Missouri over the Korean Peninsula, something they haven't done for quite a few years. If they provoke an overreaction from the Americans, that fits in with North Korean strategy, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not sure about overreaction, because I think actually a lot of the action that the U.S. has already taken in the latest set of tensions has created already a growing sense of worry in China, thinking particularly about ballistic missile defense, which is something that the Chinese have a strong dislike of going back already for some time. But now with movement of new BMD relevant capabilities to the region, a decision by the United States to beef up some of its missile defense sites on the west coast of the US. Those are developments that China doesn't like. It probably also doesn't like very visible demonstrations such as B-2 or B-52 overflights of the Korean Peninsula, the decision by the US to keep a set of B-2s stationed in Guam for a longer period of time. These decisions are already muddying what I think are broader regional tensions and creating really second-order effects that might be greater in the short term than the first-order effects of the North Korean nuclear problem.
Right. But on John Kerry's recent visit, I mean, he went to the region, I might have misread this, but my impression was he went to the region to tighten the screw on North Korea, to show them that there was unity and that the North Koreans weren't going to get anywhere. But when he arrived in Seoul, he heard the South Koreans saying, well, we want to talk to the North Koreans. When he arrived in Beijing, the Chinese said, well, we want negotiations as well. The Americans are sort of saying, well, we want to talk, but not until the North Koreans have given up everything. So, in a sense, rather than getting the unity from the region, the North Korean divide strategy is having some success.
No, I don't think that's the case. I think that, first, I don't think the South Koreans would have said what they said without careful clearance with the United States first. And I think what the North Koreans are being presented with in a coordinated way is, you have said you want talks about what kind of things, but not about the nuclear issue. Fine. You want to talk about the nuclear issue? You talk to us, the United States. That door's open. We made that clear. You want to talk about the other stuff? We're not going to talk about it. That stuff you can talk to the South Koreans about. And that, in the American Parliament, shapes North Korea's options. They've got a clear path, and they've got to decide which way they're going. At the moment, they refuse to talk to anybody. I think that the most important part of Kerry's tour wasn't talking to the existing allies, to South Korea and Japan. It was the conversations in Beijing. And I think what came out of those conversations will really have worried the North Koreans. The fact that Kerry sort of says that the Chinese are now serious about implementing sanctions, and the Chinese did not contradict that. And normally, if the Americans misrepresent their position, the next day the Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson will come out and say, actually, China's position is, and then without reference directly to the Americans, set out something different. They didn't do that. So they let Kerry's remarks stand. And I think the most single interesting point to come out of that was not Kerry making his carefully prepared statement. It was what he let drop, groggy with jet lag, at 4 o'clock in the morning, just before he went back, where he said that the Chinese had agreed to act on North Korea in the commercial context. Now, China, as we all know, is North Korea's lifeline. If the Chinese are going to start carrying out United Nations sanctions, inspecting the transport as they're supposed to, blocking all the weapons that have been going through Dalian for years now, and which other countries keep picking up and seeing that the Chinese doesn't let them through. If that changes, then North Korea has a real problem. And I think that part of the North Korean reaction to those talks would have been simple terror. The Americans go and you've got your major enemy sitting with your major ally agreeing that they're going to put you out of business. What are you going to think?
Well, I'll bring John in here. I mean, the Americans have been waiting for the Chinese to take action on North Korea for quite a few decades now. Have almost outsourced their foreign policy, it seemed, at certain points. The Chinese have sort of strung them along. Why should the Chinese change their policy now, and why should they do any favors to the Americans at a time when Kerry was also in the region, solidifying the alliance with Japan and making a very strong statement about defending disputed islands?
Well, that's the clear reason why the Chinese have an interest, because unless and until North Korea is restrained, the argument for Japan to strengthen its partnership with the United States increases. The need for the United States to demonstrate that it will stand shoulder to shoulder with Tokyo in protecting the Senkakus becomes that more powerful. That's the argument that rationally the Americans, I think, have tried to use to get China to act. I I think John's right to emphasize what hasn't happened, that we haven't had a statement from the Chinese, in a sense, contradicting what Kerry was saying. But also, I'm not sure that the tea leaves conclusively prove what you're suggesting, that the Chinese are prepared to do more. I'm tempted to say talk is cheap, in the sense that, making public statements, and the Chinese are very good at couching this in ways that are ambiguous. I mean, think of the Boao Forum, in which the international media reported Xi Jinping as talking about the need for all of the states involved in the region to behave responsibly. That could have been as much directed as Washington as it was at Pyongyang. I think it's very hard to imagine how a new leader in China, who's still negotiating to solidify his own power in the Politburo, is able to have that authority to be able to take such a risky stance vis-à-vis North Korea, because of all the reasons that are often well rehearsed. A North Korea that really has the screws imposed on it runs the risk of collapsing. And what the Chinese worry about is a mass exodus of refugees across the border. They worry about a geostrategic vacuum emerging on the peninsula that the South Koreans and the Americans would then fill, threatening China's interests. Why does China have to act? After all, North Korea isn't about to launch a nuclear warhead against Beijing, and it's certainly probably not going to launch it against South Korea, given what Andrea was saying. Therefore, how much of a problem is it? This actually gives China a wonderful opportunity to play the role of a responsible stakeholder. It gets the kudos of acting as the convener of the next round of the six-party talks, if they happen. The pressure is actually, I would argue, on the Americans. The Chinese can say, it's time for you to change. It's time for you to adopt a new, more flexible approach.
Yeah.
May I come in?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm not saying that the Chinese are going to change their policy. What I was saying was that the possibility of any such change and the way that the Chinese reacted to Kerry's visit, that alone will have worried Pyongyang. Whether the Chinese change, I think, there's clearly a debate underway in Beijing now between the usual people in favour of keeping the status quo and the people who've been arguing for some time that keeping hold of North Korea damages China's prestige. It's expensive. Remember, over half the Chinese aid budget goes to keeping North Korea afloat. And that, critically, it damages China's relations with the United States. That debate has continued for many years now. I get the sense that it's tilting towards those who are favouring severing of ties with North Korea, but I don't think that we're anywhere near a conclusion yet, and I have no idea which way it might finally come out. I agree with the points that John makes, that the Chinese worry about the refugees crossing the border if North Korea implodes. They also worry about a possible movement north to the Chinese border by US troops should Korea unite. And interestingly, Chinese are starting to say now that they are starting to draw parallels between what happened between the two Germanys, leading to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, and what's happening between the two Koreas, leading to problems in China. I mean, I think that's indicating neurosis more than rational thought, but they are actually coming out and saying this. I think, though, that there is another element to this, that the two key Chinese aims, preventing refugee flows into the Chinese Rust Belt, preventing American troops moving north, are to an extent assured by the current arrangements on the peninsula. Those are not the only arrangements that will meet those objectives. And one of the possibilities that intrigues me is that at some stage the Chinese decide to cash in their chips. They know that the Americans desperately want a deal of some kind over North Korea. They want North Korea dealt with. And they offer the United States cooperation over North Korea way above what they're getting from China now in exchange for what? I mean, there are all kinds of Chinese desiderata there. They're worried about Japan. There's all kinds of things that America can give China in Asia. I don't know if it'll ever happen, but it is a possibility, as I say, that intrigues me.
Can I just add one small thing to that? Yeah. Just, I mean, what hasn't happened? We've had South Korea and the United States consistently approaching the Chinese and saying, we need to collectively, jointly, the three of us, consider a scenario in which North does collapse. We need some strategic plan. And what have the Chinese said consistently? We won't even entertain a discussion about that, because this is effectively our sphere of influence. despite the fact that the Chinese themselves, according to informed reports, have been doing that for a number of years. The second point I would say is, in terms of public presentation, Kerry has all the factors, all the motivations to engage in his own act of political spin, to come back from the region without something concrete. He's got to say that the Chinese are willing to do something. And this at a time when you've got a divided Congress, when you have the United States having to make good on its desire to solidify this pivot to Asia. I don't think the Americans came away from this with anything really concrete.
It's also a time of great mistrust in Asia, because in the Chinese press you're seeing quite a lot of talk about American containment strategies, about the South China Sea, the American bolstering of the Vietnamese and Filipino claim, there's Burma. There's the Americans, the Chinese have a sense that the Americans are at work up to their nefarious methods with the pivot back to Asia, bolstering its naval position. I'm still slightly lost to see why the North Koreans would want to bail out the Americans in North Korea, unless there was something they were being really threatened with, some leverage. But what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think that's quite right. The Chinese do at least publicly say that they feel a sense of encirclement, and I get the sense as well that in the latest set of tensions, there's this has almost served for them as a visible reminder of what the pivot to Asia strategy might be like, and really how it could develop in a worrying direction in the future in terms of the type of military assets that the U.S. could bring to the region. But again, it's very difficult to say whether North Korea is trying actively to play with these dynamics. I certainly haven't seen evidence to suggest that's exactly what they're thinking about, but it's definitely a possibility. Whether they're trying perhaps just more immediately to sense what the reaction directly to North Korean statements is, or developments in the region, I think that's perhaps the more likely scenario, but it is possible.
They've always been good on timing.
They have.
But we're sort of coming towards the end, so we better throw open for any kind of questions about
Just before
any
you, can I just come back on John things?
Yeah, of course.
Yes. It was entirely predictable that Kerry claims victory. He's got to do that. He's an American politician. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising and significant was the absence of any Chinese rebuttal. The Chinese, yes, regard North Korea as their sphere of influence. Absolutely. This is 18th century diplomacy. This is a chip which you can cash in at some point if you want to, exchange for favours elsewhere. And the fact that they're regarded as theirs to play actually, I think, sort of complicates North Korea's position rather than bolsters it.
Any questions? Oh, yes. One here. Yeah.
John, you were mentioning sort of Park Geun-hye's possibly quite unique position in being able to sort of influence a change in inter-Korean relations. She's been talking about her desire for an alignment policy away from the two extremes of the past. But I think a lot of people in South Korea have been saying, well, with the Cheonan and the Yongpyeong attacks, that this is not possible. Do you think that for Park Geun-hye, this sort of whole furor has been a final blow to that idea of that kind of policy, or do you think she'll maintain and stick with it, or do you think she'll shift slightly?
I think it's very difficult to say at this point. I mean, she faces the dilemma that all South Korean presidents have, which is that they're one-term wonders. 5 years isn't much time in order to really affect change. One would hope that she wouldn't make the mistake that Lee Myung-bak made, which is to develop such a hard, entrenched position that she can't row back from that. I think her language has been quite illustrative of a kind of pragmatism. A lot of us worry that she, in terms of her political practice, she isn't well versed in actually coordinating internal decision-making within her own cabinet. And that's partly a function, I think, of her own unique experience of having seen both of her parents assassinated. That talking to South Koreans who know her, what I've often heard is that she's someone who doesn't trust the people around her, which is rather ironic given that she's talked about trust policy with North Korea. And so if she is, because of that, a bit of a control freak, how is she going to manage this very difficult relationship where the North constantly uses these provocations to try and outmaneuver her? I think the other problem is that, in terms of her policy-making agenda, she's not only got the issue of North Korea, which is a major headache, she's got this question of creating the basis of economic prosperity in the South, but narrowing the gap between the haves and the have-nots. She's tried to present herself as a president who can heal the ideological divide that's been at the heart of South Korean politics really since 1948. And it's very difficult for her to do that, but I think that's probably at an emotional gut level as important, if not more important, than the question of relations with North Korea, which after all, in a sense, can rumble on because South Korean public opinion doesn't need it to be resolved, and in a sense because it's a long-term project that goes beyond a 5-year mandate.
Also, as a conservative politician, she went to North Korea and met Kim Jong-il.
Right.
So the dictator's daughter met the dictator's son, and that means quite a lot coming from the right wing of South Korean politics.
It means a great deal, and it's been interesting that there have been members of her own party who have been speaking publicly in favour of a more pragmatic approach, and of course the opposition as well, and that's redounded to her benefit in terms of her popularity, which is around about, I think, the 40% mark. She came back from that visit to North Korea and gave a speech at Cambridge where she talked very pragmatically about this need for an improved relationship with the North. Unfortunately, the North isn't giving her too many opportunities to make good on that sort of offer. So we come back to this other ambiguous question, which is Kim Jong-un. Does he want a settlement, or does he want to maintain this state of hostility?
It's not in their nature to make things easy, though, is it?
The North Koreans? No.
No, that wouldn't.
No.
That wouldn't make sense.
Make the leadership sweat
People,
for a bit.
people,
and then
people want it more. If you don't. Yes.
Hi, I've got a question about the selling of nuclear capabilities, whether it's to other rogue states or to non-state actors and terrorist groups. I mean, first of all, what do you think the chances that North Korea would do this? And second of all, do you think that given the changing situation, this is more likely to happen?
Well, we were talking about red lines earlier on. I think that might be selling weapons to Al-Qaeda might be one of those red lines. But Andrea, that's one for you, I think.
I think you've hit exactly on a key point here, really, which is that the North Korean nuclear problem has two sides. Well, they're related, but one is that North Korea, of course, has its own nuclear weapons capability, and the other is that North Korea has perhaps both the capability and the intent to proliferate it. And the second one is deserving of much more immediate concern, I would suggest, though John is very right to point out that time is not in great supply as relates to the North's own possession of nuclear capability either. But unless China does implement sanctions more actively and ensure that you can cut supply and demand on the question of proliferation so that North Korea can't get its nuclear technology or related material to a would-be buyer, then this is going to be a real concern. And North Korea has shown that it's willing to both take up offers for payment of ballistic missile-related technology, etc., when it's given the opportunity, but it's also willing to go to great lengths to make that happen, and certainly occasionally get caught doing it. So that's going to be a continuing concern as it relates to the North Korean nuclear problem.
Yeah, I'm just one more here. If you want to come back.
Can I follow up this question about the nuclear issue? Because, of course, that's what hits the headlines. The nuanced debates here are not or anything that's hitting the general public. We get Cameron's using it as an argument for replacing Trident. In actual fact, the logical is exactly the opposite of that. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty came into force 43 years ago. In one sense, you might say it's been a remarkable success in that there were then 5 nuclear weapon powers. There are now 9, only 9, still 9 too many, but nevertheless, it was a remarkable success. On the other hand, you could say it's a total abject failure because Article 6 of the NPT commits the existing 5 nuclear powers to negotiate to get rid of their nuclear weapons, and they have not done so. And in fact, the only reason why North Korea or any other country might want nuclear weapons is because the original 5 nuclear weapons give credence to the idea that they do have some military and or political utility. And if we could get that idea over, that the P5 did actually fulfill their obligations, we'd be in a far better situation, not only with regard to North Korea, but with all around the world.
Yes, certainly. Was there one final question behind?
I'm just looking at it, maybe if you could comment perhaps in the context of globalisation and more economically. I mean, something I read recently was pointing out that North Korea is a kind of a block in a sense to economic movement from Russia and China on the northern side and Japan and South Korea on the other side. And I wonder what, perhaps how do you see the end game for China and the US, particularly in that context, in terms of building railways, in terms of free flow of goods and so on?
There has been talk of a railway, hasn't
The railway and a pipeline as well.
The railway has actually been completed. With great fanfare, they completed the railway through the demilitarised zone, and it was completed, and that was the end of that. It never.
And the Russians are still talking about a pipeline.
They have actually built a railway spur from the Russian border to is it Chongjin? No, to Rason, up in the northeast. But the trouble is that everyone recognises the economic imperative for linking South Korea through North Korea to Russia, China, and other countries. Every time it comes up, that North Koreans demand such exorbitant amount in rents that the projects tend to fall apart.
Very good. Well, we've come to the end. I hope we went beyond. I'm sure we went beyond Fat Boy, a Dictator with Bomb. I think John Everard, thank you very much. Andrea Berger and John Swenson-Wright. Thank you.